um, my mind sort of working again around this research, because one of the things that I realize is that no one has really done anything with it in the last, geez, at this point, 8 years since we published the original study. So it's almost a decade into this research that we've done, and I'm kind of looking to revive it. So I want to talk a little bit about that today. What this research is, the sort of social identity perspective of a number of topics, and in this case, inspiration. And then also to kind of talk about some future ideas and how this might apply to students or student-centered work. All right, just trying to get everything set up. All right, so I'm going to start by talking about what the sort of social psych perspective is approaching a number of different topics. I'm going to delve a little bit into our research. Myself and my colleague Stephen Ryson uh, did back in 2015, 2016. And then to talk a bit about the applications and future study regarding this. So the social psych perspective revolves around this idea of person and environment, where we would argue sort of personality psychologists are at one end of the spectrum, and they're focused on the person, and then you have sort of like sociologists who are almost entirely focused on the environment or the culture. Social psychologists are kind of stuck in between, where we're interested in wanting to understand how the person and the environment interact. So a lot of this work comes from Kurt Lewin, sort of the defined father of experimental social psychology. And Kurt Lewin, back in 1936, proposed the sort of mathematical equation. It's not really math, but this idea that behavior, um, B, is a function of person and environment. So that in order to understand human behavior, we have to understand both the individual that is behaving in that way and also the environment in which the person exists. So again, if we want to understand, let's say, students in our class, or someone who comes into our one of our offices at Highlands, we want to understand a faculty member or someone in administration. We kind of need to understand the full picture. We need to understand who they are, but we also need to understand the environment in which they live, they exist, they grew up in, and whatnot. And so what this kind of leads us with is this idea that humans, or that us, the people that we study are products of this environment. And one of the most basic ways in which we study this is through the process of construals, or sort of how individuals construe or understand their world. Um, and so the idea behind this is that everyone, due to this sort of person plus environment interaction, has this sort of different or potentially different perspective. And one of the approaches into understanding people is to not necessarily make those upfront assumptions that our interpretation of events or our understanding of the world might be different based on some of these environmental aspects. And this is kind of what gets us into the realm of when, someone wants to talk about the idea of social constructs, or this idea that there are things that are socially constructed in our world. Our understanding of them is going to be based on the environment. And so, from a modern perspective, we might view, the hot button topics like gender as a social construct. I wouldn't view that as too hot button from my own study, but this idea of like what it means to be male, what it means to be female, or masculine or feminine, is in part defined by the cultures in which we grow up in, and our peer groups and the media that we're exposed to, and a number of these things sort of shape our understanding of that. Um, and we can see kind of historical examples of this and whatnot, but these sort of constructs, interpretations are heavily influenced by our environment. As a professor, I think a lot about what it means to be a teacher. and what I should be doing in class or how I should be presenting myself in a classroom setting, much in the same way that I have to think about how my students might be interpreting that. And so, you know, when they spend 12 grades sitting down, being quiet, and listening to their teacher talk, and then they come into one of our classrooms and we're like, ask us questions, talk to us, let's delve into this a lot more. There's this like culture shock almost, because their construction of what a classroom setting is very different than some of us might have. And then some professors are perfectly fine with that. uh, and so to kind of take this a step further, what I'm interested in terms of social identity theory, which I'll talk about in a second, is that part of this, these construals, the social construct is built around our group, the groups that we belong to. And so our groups, the groups that we are a part of, shape our environment. So this is true from the family that we grow up in, the households, that's basic information that we start. And this expands to our friends when we start school or we kind of move outside the house, our peers, our jobs, our hobbies, and even our politics. I mean, that those are groups that we identify with, especially this year. That's very salient, and I'll talk about that. So, what this sort of basic perspective leads us into is a more, I guess, narrow perspective of social psychology that I study, which is social identity theory, where we study how one's identity with the group shapes in part how they view the world, they behave, etc. And so a lot of this work comes out of from two individuals, Henry Tajfel and John Turner. So Tajfel sort of sets up social identity theory, defining sort of what is a group, and we can say that social identity works in some of the most minimal settings, with groups as small as three people. I mean, that's generally what we define a group as. Um, what Tajfel basically defines is that being a part of a group kind of creates sort of biases towards that group. The higher your identity with the group, the more you're likely to sort of follow certain norms or rules associated with that group. And then it kind of leads to two sort of big things: in-group bias, where we tend to view our groups or the groups that we belong to as more positive, just kind of natural. We're part of those groups. We want to feel good about those groups. And then also, because we're more focused on our groups, our in groups, rather than out groups, it develops what's called out group homogeneity. And that basically sets up this idea that we know less about the out group. And so we tend to stereotype them more. We tend to say that they're more similar than us because we're more different and more nuanced and more diverse because we know our people better. And this can go pretty simply, or this can be narrowed down into to really basic levels. Tajfel showed that we can even divide people based on what he defined as minimal groups, based on things like the flip of a coin, choosing one painting over another. And we're talking about strangers in some of these early studies. So people who never knew each other before coming into this study would be divided into groups A and B based on a heads or tails flip on a coin, and we would still see some of these group aspects build out. That after a minimal amount of time together, the heads group would start to develop a more biased favorability towards their own group. They would define their own group as being more diverse and more different, whereas the tails group are more alike one another, and vice versa. And so these sort of basics of social identity hold up in the more prominent groups, political groups, religious communities, universities, but they also happen at the most simple level, or some of the most simple levels. And so this is expanded, and kind of where my interest for this study comes in is through the work of John Turner. And Turner kind of expands social identity theory into what's called self-categorization theory. That basically defines what happens when people act as a group. And so what he's really interested in is what happens when your identity becomes salient, so sort of at the forefront of your mind, and says that the prominence or the sort of power of the group when it becomes salience is tied to sort of two big things: accessibility. So how easy is it for you to think of yourself as a member of the group? That's going to boost identity, boost your likelihood to behave like a group member, and then also fit. And so how well do you sort of see yourself as a member of the group? How well do you fit into that group itself? Um, and what we know for this is that when groups are made salient, this can affect the individual in very I guess sort of interesting ways. I mean, I guess for me it's interesting, but to see sort of the power of group identity. Riker et al. Basically defined in a series of studies that we can manipulate personality through salient groups. So in particularly neuroticism, just like level of emotional stability or instability, found that when students were asked to compare themselves to um, these were Australian students when they were asked to compare themselves to students from a more prominent university. So maybe me asking Highland students to compare themselves to Harvard students. What we actually see is that group comparison, that sort of salient group comparison creates higher levels of neuroticism, so more emotional instability. But then when asked to compare themselves in this study to the native Aborigines, which most students would have higher status, then what we see is a reduction, or what they saw was a reduction in neuroticism. And so this idea that we can kind of make certain groups salient, or when certain groups become salient, uh, can kind of change how someone sort of perceives and understands the world and maybe even feels about themselves. And so what we wanted to do was try to understand this through a different lens, something that hasn't been or hadn't at the time been studied through the lens of social identity, and that's inspiration. So can we, let's say, create sort of a salient group comparison, make people think about groups that they're inspired by or that they're motivated by, and would that change how they perceived or understood inspiration from those sources? So, one more definition. Inspiration. A lot of the modern research on inspiration comes to the work of Thrash and Elliott, and they define inspiration in a very particular way. They basically say that inspiration is this sort of force that is evoked, that it sort of manifests within us. It comes from, and it is evoked by some source. It can be, I guess, sort of self-evoked, but there's usually something that sort of primes it. Once it's evoked, we see what's called transcendence, where the person enters this sort of state that kind of goes beyond the person. This could be kind of a creative mindset, but this is kind of the more I guess wishy-washy part of the definition, because it's sort of what is transcendence is going to be very personal, but they define it as sort of this state that goes sort of beyond the person. It's beyond just them. It could be their group. It could be creative burst. It's inspiration. It is what they're defining. And what this does is it activates a motivation, or a state of motivation through this sort of transcendence. And this motivation sort of primes people to go out and do something, to then they are inspired by something, and then they are inspired to do something. And then that sort of motivational state um, is what they're inspired to do. They go out and create, build, write, whatever it might be. And so they define, I mentioned that sort of buy-in too. They define that inspiration does come from a source. It has to be evoked. And so we are inspired by things. And there was some research that looked at groups and kind of what inspires people. And Burleson found that the groups that we belong to are typically defined as more inspirational. They weren't really looking at the sort of social identity perspective specifically, but they were sort of making notes that people tended to report things like my friends, my family, the people around me, the people I'm engaging in are what are sort of evoking these levels of inspiration. And then they also find in other research, Lockwood, that upward and downward comparison. So this is kind of what we see in salient identities, with the sort of upward comparison being like the better school, and the downward comparison being sort of like the native Aborigines in that Australian study, that those actually impact inspiration. And so they're kind of talking about this, but we're not really seeing the kind of research or the similar research that we were expecting to see with social identity. And that's kind of what spurred us to do our study. Um, and then so inspiration is evoked by something. It motivates us to do something. This is the active or the motivational part, that sort of approach motivation that Thrash and Elliott describe. And this is tied to things like creativity. Um, this one is, I mean, they're kind of difficult to study in some cases, but we can typically gauge how people are inspired by things by sort of priming something, making an identity salient, and then seeing how much they sort of feel inspiration. It becomes a little tougher to see if they're actually going to then go out and do something. That takes more like application-based research, or research where you kind of bring people into a lab or into a classroom setting. You try to evoke some inspiration and you kind of see what the byproduct is. There's a lot more research on the by than there is the to. Um, And so what we decided to do is we wanted to see, is there something there? We were mostly interested in the buy side of this, where we wanted to see how is that inspiration evoked within different participants. And we ran a series of studies. There were three that were published. I'll talk about, there were two that weren't published because they kind of didn't work. But I'll kind of talk about those when I'm done here. So study one, this is kind of a good insight into sort of how we do research like this. How do we want to apply a theory in psychology to something else that's been done in psychology? And so the first thing we did is there a basic relationship? Do we see these sort of relationships between social identity and inspiration? And with 175 participants, these were at Texas A&M, University Commerce, and Southeastern Louisiana University. This is back when I was working on my PhD. Basically, we used a series of measures on identity. So this is a good example of what a really basic identity scale looked like. We had people both identify themselves as Americans or university students. So it was like a manipulation. We wanted to see if higher identities maybe had a difference here. So American would be a higher level, more inclusive identity than just university student. Um, and then we also included this sort of Thrash et al. Inspiration from a source. And so this actually studies inspiration by, so I feel inspired when thinking. It should be about being an American. And then being an American gives me insights that I strive to express. That's the inspired to side. It also looks at general inspiration, the evoking part, the transcendence part, and the motivation part. And so we wanted to see what this looks like. And what we noted is that social identity or identity with one's group was highly correlated to all of it. And that's again, it's correlation. It's not causation. It just gives us sort of a piece of the puzzle, but let us know, okay, we can do a study too now. There is a relationship here. There is something going on. Let's see if we can activate this with those other examples. So making certain identities salient. And so we created study two, and study two, where we wanted to see if social identity acts as a mediator between sort of salient identity and inspiration. So we used 183 participants in this study. And in this case, we asked people on one of two levels, again, a less inclusive and a more inclusive identity category, to recall and relive an experience of being inspiration. So think of a time you were inspired, and specifically inspired as a university student or as an American. And then we had them write a narrative experience, so that writing kind of helps to prime that salience. Um, and in this case, we use very similar, the inspiration from a source survey. And what we find is this is the model, but the kind of short answer or the short results is that our hypothesis is confirmed, that social identity acts as sort of a mediator. So salient identity impacts inspiration. We do see a relationship there, but when we sort of plug in group identification into the model, it becomes more significant. It becomes sort of this sort of powerful mediating factor. It sort of explains the relationship that exists, that people, when thinking about a time that they're inspired, of course makes them more inspired or they feel inspiration from it, but the explanation for that was the strength of their identity. And so students who had high university identity were more inspired. Uh, and then finally, we wanted to do those outgroup comparisons. So what happens when we have people compare themselves to um, high stereotyped inspiring people or low stereotyped inspiring people. And no offense to accountants, but we kind of use them as sort of the not typically viewed as inspiring, whereas artists create, have that sort of stereotype for creativity. And so we ask people to sort of compare themselves as students or Americans compared to artists. And so the idea is that the average person is going to be less inspired than an artist is, and maybe more inspired than an accountant is. Um, so with 271 participants, we once again sort of go back, found significance in this study or in this hypothesis. And so what we ultimately find is that when taking all of this into account, when we prime that sort of salient group comparison, we see that people are more inspired when they think about themselves compared to accountants because their group comparison, the baseline is higher, and then we see themselves as inspired less when they compare themselves to artists. Uh, and so where does this take us? Um, we really only examine the sort of from side, inspired by, not inspired to do something. So we really didn't look at like outcomes. We did run two additional studies where we tried to see if we can change the source of that evocation. So they would read the same inspiring passage, they would view the same pieces of art, and we would change whether or not that art was coming from an American versus a Chinese artist as sort of in group, out group. Think about yourself as an American. Here's a quote from Stephen King, American author, versus here's a quote from a Chinese author or from an unnamed source. And what we ultimately found is that it didn't really change anything. And our kind of conclusion from that was not that people wouldn't be more inspired by people from their in group, is just that like some paintings are just inspiring and some quotes and passages are just going to be more inspiring than others. And so we kind of figured we had kind of a good shell to kind of put out there for maybe someone else to pick up on, or maybe us to do some future research on. But a lot of the research that was kind of sort of the next steps would involve a lot more work, just in terms of resources, materials, participation. And so we weren't really able to look at the two side of this. And so the what inspire what are people inspired to do? Do we actually see some outcome? And so the application side of this is sort of really missing. Sorry, I talked about that. Um, and so what I've been thinking of over the last year or so, and I'm currently waiting to see if we're going to get funding from a grant on this, so that'll determine whether or not for the next year and a half I'm going to run an application-based study. But is this like this idea of how do we apply this to different groups? And so if we look at something like inspiration, we know that it is evoked from an outside source. And so for the person, we would say that that could come from their group identity, which for students enrolling in college, we would argue that this probably should be happening at like a much younger age. But specifically, I'm interested in things like STEM identity or student identity. And so, what does it mean to be a student? What does it mean to be a good student, a successful student? And if we can find that sort of those bonds with, if students could find those bonds with people around them, then it may evoke inspiration through these aspects of social identity. And so, what should happen is that through their identity with the group, it should sort of inspire them to success. That's sort of the hypothetical there. Um, and so we should see that kind of move from evocation in these different classroom settings with this sort of feelings of connection. So universities in particular that kind of build student engagement or that build upon student identity should see more positive outcomes in those students. And those students should feel more inspired through both their engagement with their peers, but also that the connection with the university, the connection as a student should also come with higher levels of connections with the faculty and connections with the staff and the other members of the community who have sort of, graduated and moved on. Um, so we can be inspired by our group. That's the kind of my hypothesis around what I'd like to see, or what I expect to see in sort of future research, is that social identity is going to further sort of mediate these effects in application-based settings or in school settings. I'm kind of interested in looking at this through, particularly at Highlands. The first thing that came to my mind was the HUE programs, the Highlands Undergraduate Enrichment. This idea that students in that program are getting a more focused set of kind of classroom engagement. They're working with the same peers. They have peer mentors, and so there's all of this sort of added stuff, shared experience that should hypothetically be building group identity. And so building their identity not only as a student, but most of these HUE courses, even when one of the two learning community classes isn't STEM, the other one usually is. And so there's this high level of STEM identity that should be building out of there. Um, and what we should likely see is to kind of take it a step further with Thrash and Elliott's work, is to not only look at the from or the by and the to side of inspiration, but also the frequency that they're inspired and the intensity of their inspiration, which is what Thrash and Elliott also examine. And so the higher the frequency, the more that they're being inspired. So the more we should see that motivation. And then, of course, like the intensity of that inspiration is going to lead to higher levels of transcendence and more powerful motivation that comes out of it. So keeping that identity salient should lead, like I said, to more inspiration. And what this should lead to is behavior. It should activate that approach motivation. It should predict inspiration, but we should also see higher levels of what we kind of expect to see out of group members. And so, if part of being a student means succeeding, engaging in class, engaging with your peers, and engaging with um, faculty more, we should expect to see more of that. But that's going to depend highly on how those students sort of view their identity as a student. And again, those norms and behaviors can be shaped, especially in things like learning communities, which are focusing on far more student engagement and interaction than with other classes. And because I'm running out of time, I kind of wanted to leave this at about 30 minutes. But this would also come out of the work of what's called the theory of planned behavior. But just very briefly say that we can kind of predict behavior. So let's say student success, or how do we know if students are going to study? How do we know if students are going to be kind of working towards better understanding the material, succeeding in general, even outside of a particular class? That's going to come out of sort of three things. Again, the personal attitudes of the students themselves, which can be influenced by the groups that they belong to, the subjective norms of those groups. And so, again, what is normative? Is studying the normal thing? Is going to class the normal thing? Is engaging the normal thing? And if those are students with higher social identity, should see more predictive behaviors based on that. And then also perceived control. And this comes down to how much control the student, in this case, the student or the person feels that they have over the situation. So a student who works 40 hours a week might have less perceived control to study as much because they have other things going on in their life. Student taking care of their family is going to have maybe less perceived control over student-related activities. And so, but the idea is that maybe the sort of inspiration aspect or sort of social identity and inspiration aspects may help to promote some of these behaviors, even if it's just a little more. You might only have an hour of free time, but if there's just a little more to, like, make it through this class, instead of just blowing it off, that's also good, ultimately going to see more success for those students in the future. Uh, so So basically, we've already done this sort of groundwork and foundation, looking at how social identity affects inspiration, at least as a source. We get inspiration from the groups that we belong to, and that identity mediates the strength of that inspiration, maybe the intensity of that inspiration. What we want to see, or what I'd like to look at in the future, and what I hope to be looking at over the next year and a half, is what's next? Can we actually put this into application? Can we actually see this play out? Can we take a pre-existing, environment or system like Highlands Undergraduate Enrichment, and see these aspects of sort of inspiration, especially around identity, specifically STEM identity, which is what a lot of groups, including Armis and the Caminos Grant and a number of other groups at the university are looking into in different ways. So, all right, thank you. Let's see, I will shut this off and stop sharing.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much. And please, if anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to unmute yourself. Now's your chance. I don't see anything in the chat, but I will continue to monitor that as folks participate here.
Yes, Dr. Schneider.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for this talk, Daniel. I know you mentioned the NDA, so perhaps this question is a dead end for you to answer, but I'm really fascinated how you sort of resurrected, if that's a spooky enough word I can use during spooky season, that you kind of resurrected your interest in this research based on the invitation by the recruiting corps. And I'm curious how they heard about this work from 8 years ago, if that's something you're allowed to speak about.
Yeah, I mean, there are things that were presented that I can't talk about, like actual like data and stuff, they're from their internal side. But I mean, prior to getting the invite, the idea is that they were looking into trying to get someone to talk about, I guess, what brings people to the Marine Corps in this case, or to the military. And they were looking at a couple at the part of like the sub theme was tied to inspiration, and we had written this paper. It was a different perspective than they would have normally seen, and that was kind of part of the goal, is to bring people with different perspectives there, to kind of offer sort of different ways of looking at things. And I just kind of went and talked about the research, and sort of what the social identity perspective is. And so, yeah, it was sort of they came across the paper I wrote in 2016, and then that made me go, well, has anyone else done anything with it since then? Because they asked me to do it. And I realized that no one had. And so it kind of further spurned this interest in, wow, maybe there's something there. Maybe there's the possibility to resurrect some research on this and do something else. Going to make a comment that I made prior to, asking students to talk in class, and we're not used to doing it. That's a normative thing that everyone's sort of, I don't want to talk. I don't have any questions.
I have a question.
Sure.
Is it possible that you pull up your slide?
Oh, yeah. And hi there. I didn't
This is slide, right?
Yeah. There we go. Which one in particular?
So I think it was the study tool.
Oh yeah, let's see. Study 2. There we go. All right.
Yeah. So I see that, you guys were trying to see in-group identification like as a path to inspiration, which the result was fascinating. However, I was thinking, do you think that maybe making participants have a salient identity can actually make them identify more with their in-group, which could also be the one causing the inspiration? So could it be that maybe you guys counterbalance this such that some participant got,
Yeah.
maybe that was what happened. I don't know. Hey, Dr. Brooks. But could it be that exposure to identity from the get-go could actually make them have higher in-group identification? And that's what's leading to that result. And I can also talk to you better about this because I'm doing something similar, but it's more related to envy now. So
Yeah. Yeah, I would say definitely. At the time that we were doing this, it was more, we didn't even know it was going to work. And my colleagues' general attempt at when we're trying to make people think of themselves in groups is to kind of, for lack of a better word, beat them over the head with it. You want to make them, you want to try to, I guess, prime that identity because otherwise, because the idea, I guess, of salient identity is that, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen for a second. But the idea of salient identity is that it is primed. It does come to our mind, and so um, anytime the idea would be that any time in sort of a person's day-to-day life that kind of identity would be sort of made salient or evoked, then we should expect to see these sort of boosts anyway. It should, I guess, sort of prime identity. But for these students, I mean, I don't have the means on hand. I can go and dig them up. Um, but even for these students, when we ask them, like, think about yourselves as an American, not every student, had like on a 1 to 7 scale, a 7. And so we still saw variability in that identity. But that would be something, I guess, that would be something to think about. Because yeah, I mean, the idea is if we are priming identity, and so that should then boost identity, and then so that should affect this. But I guess it's what we're looking at was more of trying to think of the best way to word it, but more of the idea that we're still going to see, I guess, variation in that identity. And so even if we make something salient, I could take every incoming freshman student and prime their identity with Highlands. And even though they're students at Highlands, it's not going to, we should still see variation in that. I'm not going to get like a bunch of really high results. I'm going to have this sort of spread where you have students, yes, I'm at Highlands. I might be like a 2 or a 3. But it's not, maybe not their only identity, or maybe they still don't feel connected to the university in some way. And we should expect to see some variation in that. That would be, I don't know, my take. Maybe we should, and this was 2016. I don't know. I would maybe do things a little differently.
yeah. Yeah. Another thing is that, when you were showing the like American, and then you said the university name, did you guys use the actual university name, or it was just like think yourself as a university student?
Yeah, at the time we were just looking at general university student identity. So just think of yourself as like what the average student should be, regardless of where you're at.
Oh,
Um, yeah, what I want to do with in terms of replicating it with this proposed grant is we're specifically going to look at uh, New Mexico Highlands University, and so it would be the specific university to see because these programs, because the events, because of what the students are engaging in are going to be happening at that university. It would be a more specific identity. In this case, general university students going to be that higher level of salience, and so we should see some differences. But I guess it depends on, I mean, what we're asking. So, like,
yeah,
everyone can be inspired, but
it's usually different. I'll also let you know that in schools that like highly like, for example, like R1 University, for example, UT, University of Georgia, at least one of the consistent results that we find here, my advice or usually find here is that when you make UT identity salient, is a big football university too.
yeah.
So you hardly find any variation in anything. Like they are highly fused into the identity. So
Yeah. Yeah, and with both of the groups that we looked at, they weren't really, I guess, like universities that I expected really high salience in, because they weren't big football universities. Sports. If I were looking at like LSU when I was working in Louisiana, like I would expect LSU to be very different. Um, yeah, I mean, there's definitely that there. Um, and I would say, maybe, I mean, I don't want to disparage our sports teams here, but we're not like, we're we're not really thinking of ourselves as just like major collegiate athlete, university. And so we don't see that to that level of things like UT or LSU or I don't know, I'm bad at football analogies.
yeah, I understand. Thank you.
We do have one question here from Crystal, who asks, will the continued research break down subgroups such as traditional versus non-traditional students?
Yeah, absolutely. That is part of the proposal that I spent all summer writing, is to look at specifically traditional, non-traditional, first generation as a category, um, uh, other underrepresented groups. So part of that I think is an issue with sample size, and so but we can still do some analysis, some between group comparisons. The idea is that this would be almost like a pilot to see, is this something we can look at? My goal in the proposal is to do some initial data analysis or collection in the spring, and then do like a full year study. So we take incoming freshmen and sort of track them over the year. Have them do a short survey every month, and trying to kind of keep track. And then once we have that kind of data, we can then further sort of track, like, do these first year programs, do they build inspiration? Is this long lasting in terms of student success? But yeah, we should be able to break down a number of different things like that: traditional, non-traditional, first time freshmen. We can also compare that to students who are transferring into the university, students who are currently at the university. The university collects a lot of this data already, and so the goal is just to kind of reach out to um, the get my words straight, to reach out to like the students who aren't just coming in, and so to be able to just to reach out to those existing students and have them answer some questions about identity and inspiration and a number of other factors, motivation, success, behavior, engagement. So not even looking at just traditional and non-traditional, but who is actually using the outdoor recreation center, our the outdoor rec stuff that we have at the university, the materials, who's going to school events, who's showing up at professors' office hours, things that we collect, every university collects, but we're not really looking at within the realms of a lot of this sort of these psych constructs.
Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat. We have a couple of minutes before we need to ramp up for the next session, but does anyone else have anything that they'd like to ask or comment on? I don't see any hands. Okay. Well, good. Well, I think that should wrap us up here, but thank you so much. This was really, really wonderful, and we had a great turnout, had, more than 35 students or participants, I should say, today. And I want to thank everyone for joining us on this beautiful Tuesday morning. And I hope that you will stay and hear and listen to the rest of our HU talks. We've got some amazing speakers coming up. Thank you, Dr. Chadborn. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Do you want to do a test, Denise? I just saw your face.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that you could see the t-shirt.
Oh,
You could see the t-shirt. So that's good.
good. I'm glad your computer's working today.
Finally, yes. It's been drama.
Thanks.